the tailor who built a smuggling empire under Nazi noses Lyon, France. Winter 1942. In a modest textile shop on the Rue de la Republique, a 31-year-old Dutch merchant named Jean Widener measured a German officer for a winter coat. His hands were steady as he marked chalk lines across the Feldgrau cloth, his voice pleasant as he discussed delivery times. The officer never noticed how Widener's eyes tracked the street outside, watching for a signal, a woman in a blue scarf passing the window twice. To the Germans who patronized his shop, to the Vichy officials who saw him transporting fabric between Lyon, Paris, and Brussels, he was exactly what he appeared, a Protestant Dutch textile dealer with the good sense to remain neutral. But every week, when Widener loaded his truck with fabric rolls, he carried a secret that meant a firing squad if discovered. Hidden inside those bolts of cloth were forged identity papers, ration cards, travel permits, and rolls of microfilm. And in the back of that same truck, concealed behind false panels, he transported something far more dangerous. Human beings fleeing the Nazi death machine. Not 12, not 50, over 800. Each one a Jew marked for deportation, a downed Allied pilot, a resistance fighter whose capture would unravel entire networks. He made them disappear across the Swiss border, through the Pyrenees to freedom, as at the most heavily guarded frontiers in Europe, were seams he could unpick and restitch at will. The textile shop was headquarters of a smuggling empire stretching from Amsterdam to Barcelona, 800 miles of enemy territory crisscrossed with checkpoints and death. The shop gave Widener everything: a legitimate reason to travel, access to transportation networks, connections across multiple countries, and most importantly, the ability to move cargo without suspicion. Fabric had to flow, even during war. The Germans needed uniforms. A textile merchant was useful, unremarkable, safe to ignore. His actual role was stored in the back room, in a ledger that looked like inventory records but contained names, routes, safe houses, contacts. The Dutch Paris line, they would call it later. But in 1942, it was simply Jean Widener deciding that his comfortable life, his successful business, his personal safety meant nothing compared to what was happening around him. The merchant who chose war Jean Widener was born in Brussels on November 21st, 1912, to Dutch Seventh-day Adventist parents. He grew up in a household where faith meant action, where Christian belief translated into helping those in need. His father regularly sheltered World War I refugees, fed the hungry, hid deserters from both sides. Young Jean learned that righteousness sometimes required breaking laws, that there were obligations higher than state authority. By his 20s, Widener had established himself in textiles, opening shops in Lyon and Paris. He spoke French, Dutch, German, and English fluently. He was engaged, planning a future that involved inventory management, and perhaps expanding into Switzerland. After France fell in June 1940, Widener kept his shop open under German occupation. He could have spent the war profiting from a captive market, could have survived intact. What changed him happened on a July morning in 1942 in Paris, when Widener witnessed the WWII roundup. Walking through Marais district, he saw French police dragging Jewish families from their apartments. 13,000 people, mostly women and children, crammed into the cycling stadium with no food, no water, no sanitation. He heard children screaming for parents already separated. He saw elderly people beaten for moving too slowly. He watched French police load human beings into buses bound for Drancy Transit Camp, and from there to Auschwitz. He returned to Lyon unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to pretend he could continue selling fabric while this happened. His fiancée tried to reason with him. What could one man do against the entire Nazi machine? Getting involved meant death. Every practical argument said to do nothing. But Widener's father had hidden refugees. His faith demanded action, and he had seen those children's faces. He made contact with Dutch resistance members, offering his shop as a safe house, his truck as transportation. They thought he was insane. A textile merchant with no training in espionage wanted to smuggle Jews across the most fortified borders in Europe? They told him to donate money if he wanted to help, to do anything except risk himself. Widener explained. He already traveled constantly for business. He already had relationships with customs officials. He already maintained addresses in multiple cities where fabric samples could be stored. He already employed people who could be recruited. Most importantly, he was invisible. The Gestapo investigated resistance fighters, communists, political activists. They didn't investigate Protestant textile merchants with impeccable business records and German customers. He made his first run in August 1942, hiding a Jewish couple inside a shipment of fabric boats destined for a supplier near the Swiss border. He arranged for a guide to meet them, to take them across at night through a forest pass he had scouted personally. 2 people who would have died in Auschwitz were alive because a textile merchant had decided that bolts of cloth could hide more than just fabric. By November, he was running twice-weekly operations. By January 1943, he had established safe houses in Lyon, Paris, Toulouse, and Brussels, each maintained under cover of his textile business. The Dutch Paris line was becoming operational. The flaw in the machine, the Nazi occupation of France, operated on documentation. Every person required papers, identity cards, work permits, ration books, travel authorizations. Every train station had checkpoints. Every border crossing required multiple documents verified against central registries. The Gestapo maintained files on known Jews, resistance members, escaped prisoners. The penalty for aiding Jews or Allied airmen was immediate arrest, torture, execution. Between France and freedom lay borders that seemed impassable. The Swiss frontier was guarded by German patrols on one side, Swiss guards on the other, both authorized to shoot on sight. The system was designed to catch exactly what refugees needed to do: cross borders, travel without proper authorization, assume false identities. What the Germans overlooked was that certain people didn't need to assume false identities. Gene Widener already had legitimate papers, legitimate business reasons to cross borders, legitimate transportation. He wasn't a suspicious person trying to travel. He was a known merchant conducting routine business. Because textile distribution required moving cargo across borders, Widener possessed something almost no one else had: regular, approved, documented permission to cross between occupied France, Vichy France, Switzerland, and even into Belgium. The flaw wasn't in the document system itself. The flaw was that the system trusted certain categories of people, merchants with established businesses, to move freely because the occupation itself needed them. Block all trade, and the occupation economy collapsed. Widener's method exploited this gap with surgical precision. He didn't forge his own documents because his documents were genuine. He didn't sneak across borders because he had legal authorization to cross them. He didn't hide from authorities because authorities knew him as a reliable merchant. His entire operation was hidden inside legitimate business activity that the occupation government needed to continue functioning. A refugee would arrive at his Lyon shop through underground networks. Widener would house him in the apartment above the shop, officially storage space, actually a safe house with hidden rooms behind false walls. His network would prepare documents, not crude forgeries, but real papers, stolen from government offices by sympathetic clerks, or taken from deceased persons whose deaths hadn't been officially recorded yet. The papers were genuine, only the identity was false. When papers were ready and the route scouted, Widener would load his truck for a business trip. Real fabric filled the cargo area. He actually conducted textile business to maintain his cover. But between the bolts of cloth, inside specially constructed false compartments, he would conceal documents, money, or people. The Swiss border was the most dangerous crossing. German patrols walked regular routes, but Widener had spent months timing them, noting gaps, finding sections where forest cover approached the border fence. He recruited guides, Swiss sympathizers, French farmers, even German guards who could be bribed. On moonless nights, refugees would cross through those gaps, guided by people who had walked the route dozens of times. His first major success came in November 1942. A group of 16 Jews, including 6 children, needed to reach Switzerland. Widener moved them through his network in stages, from Paris to Lyon over 1 week, then from Lyon to Annecy near the Swiss border. On November 23rd, using a moonless night and a route through forest he had scouted personally, all 16 crossed successfully. Between August 1942 and March 1943, Widener's network moved 63 refugees to Switzerland and 12 escaped Allied airmen through Spain. Every operation increased the risk. Every success meant the Germans would eventually notice patterns, investigate anomalies, search harder for whoever was defeating their system. The system adapts by April 1943. Widener was operating at a scale that couldn't remain invisible. The Gestapo had noticed increased refugee flow through Lyon. Lyon headquarters assigned Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, to investigate. Barbie interrogated suspects until they talked or died, then arrested everyone they named. Widener learned about Barbie's investigation through contacts in the Lyon police on April 8th. Barbie had obtained a list of addresses where refugees had been hidden. The list included 2 of Widener's safe houses. Raids were scheduled for April 10th. Widener had 48 hours to evacuate 14 refugees before Barbie kicked down doors. That night, Widener didn't sleep, his heart hammering. Moving 14 people in 48 hours without attracting attention was nearly impossible. By dawn, he had a plan that was insane but possible. He would move everyone that day using a special fabric delivery. He would rent a large truck, load it with actual textile shipments, and hide all 14 refugees inside specially arranged cargo spaces. At each delivery stop, 1 or 2 refugees would slip out the back, meet contacts, and disappear into new safe houses. He spent April 9th executing the plan, his hands shaking every time he loaded another person into the truck. By evening, he had relocated all 14. On April 10th, Barbie's men found empty rooms, but Widener had lost 2 safe houses. And Barbie now knew with certainty that someone in Lyon was running a sophisticated network, someone smart enough to evacuate ahead of raids. The net was tightening. The informant, the man who walked into Widener's shop on May 3rd, 1943, was Maurice Lambert, a French businessman who owned a fabric warehouse in Paris. Lambert wanted to discuss a business partnership. He spoke knowledgeably about textile markets, had legitimate credentials. Everything about him suggested he was exactly what he claimed. But Lambert was actually a Gestapo informant, recruited after being caught on black market charges. Barbie had sent him specifically to investigate Widener. Lambert had betrayed 3 other networks already, sending dozens to camps and execution. Widener met with Lambert 3 times over 2 weeks. Lambert seemed genuinely helpful. He never asked suspicious questions, never pushed too hard. He was perfect, which was precisely what made Widener uneasy. On May 18th, one of Widener's contacts in Paris, a woman who managed a safe house, was arrested. Gestapo had gone directly to her apartment with her name already on their list. The only new person who knew about her was Lambert. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Lambert was Gestapo. He had been watching Widener for 3 weeks. Now Barbie would give Lambert more time to gather complete information before making arrests. One of his guides sent an urgent message. Swiss intelligence had records showing Lambert working with Gestapo. Widener made his decision. He would not cut contact suddenly. That would trigger arrests. Instead, he would feed Lambert false information while quietly evacuating the real operation. On May 24th, Widener met Lambert at a cafe, his heart pounding. While they talked about fabric shipments, Widener carefully mentioned a safe house that was actually abandoned, gave Lambert the name of a contact who didn't exist, and described an escape route that led nowhere useful. Lambert believed everything. For 2 weeks, Widener maintained contact with Lambert while simultaneously evacuating the real network. On June 7th, Barbie made his move. Gestapo raided 4 addresses Lambert had provided. They found nothing. The addresses were abandoned. Barbie had been fed useless information. But Barbie now knew with absolute certainty that the textile merchant was his target. Who else could have orchestrated such a deception? The network had survived, but Widener's name was known, his face identified, and he was being hunted specifically. The sister on June 15th, 1943, Widener received a message that made his blood freeze. His sister Gabrielle, who worked as a nurse in Amsterdam and knew nothing about his resistance work, had been arrested by Gestapo. The trap was obvious. Barbie couldn't find Widener directly. He had gone underground. So Barbie had taken his sister, knowing Widener would learn about it. knowing that Widener faced an impossible choice: surrender himself to save her, or continue operations and let his own sister suffer for his choices. Gabrielle was 33 years old, a devout Seventh-day Adventist, someone who spent her life helping others. She had never joined the resistance, never broke any laws. Her only crime was being Gene Widener's sister. Now she sat in a Gestapo cell, terrified, confused, subjected to interrogation about activities she knew nothing about. For 2 days, Widener functioned in a haze of horror. His network contacts urged him to continue operations. Terrible as it was, Gabrielle was one person. The network saved dozens every month. If Widener surrendered, those dozens would die while Gabrielle died anyway. Gestapo never honored deals. On June 17th, a message arrived claiming to be from Gabrielle. They want you to surrender. They say they'll release me if you do. Please don't come. I know what you're doing matters. Save them. I'll be fine. Widener stared at those words for hours. She wasn't fine. She would never be fine. But Gabrielle was telling him to let her die for his work, to value strangers over his own sister. He spent that night in an abandoned warehouse, and he wept, not quietly. He sobbed until his ribs ached. And when the crying stopped, when the sun rose on June 18th, he knew what he would do. He would not surrender. He would continue operations. He would save strangers while his sister suffered for his choices. He would carry this for the rest of his life. But he would also do everything possible to get her released. He contacted every connection he had: Dutch resistance members, sympathetic German officers who might be bribed, Swiss diplomats. He offered money, information, anything except himself. Nothing worked. By July 1943, Gabrielle had been transferred to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Expansion through trauma, his network noticed a change. Widener had always been careful, methodical, strategic. Now he was taking risks that terrified his contacts, moving larger groups than was safe, accepting refugees whose papers were questionable, pushing guides to use routes that were too exposed. His lieutenants had to restrain him, forcing him to think strategically instead of emotionally. Yet operations continued. In August, 37 refugees moved through the network. In September, 41. The Dutch Paris line had become a genuine organization that could survive even when its founder was breaking apart. By October, Widener had regained some control. The guilt remained, would never leave, but he could function through it. And what he planned was audacious. The network would expand. Instead of contracting under pressure, Widener decided the Dutch Paris line would grow until it moved refugees on a scale that made individual arrests meaningless. If Barbie caught 10 people, Widener would save 100. The expansion began in November 1943. And within 3 months, the network had tripled in size. New safe houses opened in Brussels, Toulouse, Annecy, and Paris. New guides were recruited and trained. Widener slept 3 hours a night. He lost 30 pounds. His hair started graying at 32. His fiancée broke their engagement. The network was everything now, his penance, his offering to whatever God allowed his sister to suffer while he walked free. By February 1944, the Dutch Paris line had moved over 400 refugees to safety. It had become one of the largest escape networks in occupied Europe. And Klaus Barbie had decided enough was enough. The February raids, Barbie had spent months infiltrating the network with informants, tracking movements, identifying safe houses, mapping the entire structure. On February 27, 1944, Gestapo would strike everywhere at once in simultaneous raids across 3 countries. Widener learned about the planned raids on February 25th through a contact in the Lyon police. The orders included Widener's name at the top of the arrest list, along with 47 other network members. 48 hours. He had 48 hours to evacuate 47 people and reorganize operations. It was impossible. That night, Gene Widener made a decision that his lieutenants would argue about for years. He would not evacuate everyone. He would send messages to specific people, the most exposed, the most valuable, giving them 48 hours to disappear. Everyone else would receive warnings too late, would be arrested in the raids. It was triage. It was sacrifice. His logic was brutal and sound. If everyone fled, Barbie would know the network had advance warning, would torture capture members even more viciously to find informants. But if most arrests happened as planned, the leak would remain hidden. The police contact who saved 47 lives would be safe to warn again. The network could rebuild. 20 people received warnings in time. 27 did not. On February 27, 1944, Gestapo arrested 43 people connected to the Dutch-Paris line. Barbie expected to capture Gene Widener. Instead, he arrested shop assistants, safe house landlords, couriers, important people, but not the leadership. The arrested members were tortured for weeks. 5 died during interrogation. 18 were sent to camps. 20 survived and were eventually released. And Widener carried their names like weights. Paul Verhoeven died in Buchenwald. Suzanne Leclerc survived Ravensbrück. Michel Dubois executed after interrogation. 27 people sacrificed. 400 refugees saved. The mathematics of resistance. But the Dutch-Paris line survived. Within 2 months, operations resumed using new safe houses, new routes, new methods. In March 1944, the network moved 63 refugees. In April, 71. In May, 94 people, the largest monthly total of the entire operation. Liberation and aftermath by June 1944. Widener's name appeared on wanted posters across France. The reward for his capture had increased to 100,000 francs. His closest contacts begged him to leave France. The invasion had happened. Allied forces were pushing through Normandy. He had trained dozens of people. His presence was no longer essential, only dangerous. Widener refused. 17 refugees were currently in transit. If anything went wrong, those 17 people would need someone who understood the entire system. So he would stay until they were safe. On July 8, 1944, Gene Widener made a decision that seemed insane. He would go to Paris, the capital of occupied France, the most dangerous city in the country for someone with his face on wanted posters. He would go to Paris because that's where the need was greatest. His contacts thought he'd lost his mind. But Widener's logic was that Barbie expected him to hide in small towns to avoid major cities. Going to Paris was so reckless that it might actually be safer. From a Montmartre apartment, Widener coordinated operations that moved 38 refugees through Paris in August 1944. On August 19th, Paris rose in insurrection. For 6 days, while Paris burned and bullets filled the streets, Gene Widener moved to the combat zone coordinating the rescue of 17 refugees trapped in safe houses, cut off by fighting. By August 24th, all 17 were safe. Paris was liberated on August 25th, 1944. Gene Widener stood in the crowds watching Allied tanks roll through, and he wept. Not from joy, though he felt that. Not from relief. He wept because he had survived when so many hadn't. Because Gabriel was still in Ravensbrück while he walked free. Because the network members who died would never see this day. Between September and December 1944, while most of France celebrated liberation, the network continued. German forces still held Belgium and the Netherlands. The refugees still came, the hardest cases, people who would be executed immediately if captured. In October, Widener received word that his sister Gabrielle had been freed during Allied liberation of Ravensbrück. She was alive. After more than a year in the camp, after torture and starvation and disease, Gabrielle had survived. She was in a British field hospital, suffering from malnutrition and typhus, but expected to recover. Gene Widener traveled to see her. When he arrived and saw Gabrielle, this woman who had weighed 140 pounds in 1943 and now weighed 87, who had lost her hair from typhus, whose body bore scars from beatings, he couldn't stay. The guilt was physical. Looking at her meant confronting what his choices had cost. He stayed 2 days. She told him she was proud of what he'd done, that her suffering meant something because of the lives he'd saved. Her forgiveness was genuine and complete, and it made everything worse because Gene Widener could not forgive himself. By January 1945, the Dutch-Paris line was essentially finished. The war was ending. Gene Widener had succeeded. The network he built had moved over 800 people to safety, had operated for 3 years without being destroyed, had defied Klaus Barbie and the entire Gestapo apparatus, and he had no idea what to do with himself now that the need had stopped. The truth of numbers of liberation brought investigators trying to document what had happened. In 1946, a Dutch government commission interviewed Widener, asking for documentation. Widener had almost nothing. The network had operated in secret, maintaining minimal records. Most documentation had been destroyed during crises. The commission was skeptical. Over 800 people rescued, and almost no documentation to prove it. They suspected exaggeration. The proof came from the refugees themselves. Word spread through survivor communities that the Dutch government was investigating Gene Widener's claims. Letters arrived at the commission office, dozens at first, then hundreds. Each letter from someone who had crossed into Switzerland through a textile merchant's network, or would walk through the Pyrenees with guides arranged by a Dutch businessman, or would hidden in a Lyon apartment above a fabric shop. By 1948, researchers had verified 812 people rescued by the Dutch Paris line. The actual number was likely higher, but 812 was a number that could be proven. Each number represented not just one life, but ripple effects that extended into the future. Researchers calculated that by 1970, 25 years after the war, the 812 documented rescues had resulted in approximately 3,400 additional people who existed because Widener's network saved their ancestors. By 2020, that number exceeded 15,000. But the recognition was complicated. Widener had saved over 800 people, but at least 43 network members had been arrested, tortured, or killed during operations. Gene Widener refused to answer questions about whether he'd made the right choices. In rare interviews, he would only say, "I did what I could with what I had. Others would have done it better." The recognition that came too late in 1950, the Dutch government awarded Gene Widener the Resistance Memorial Cross. In 1958, Israel named him righteous among the nations. In 1978, the French government made him a Knight of the Legion of Honor. These honors accumulated over decades, each one arriving years too late to mean what they might have meant during the actual crisis. By the time the awards came, Widener had built a different life. He had moved to the United States, worked as a missionary for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, married, had children, lived quietly in California. He rarely discussed the war years. His own children grew up not knowing their father had saved over 800 lives. When researchers found him in the 1980s, Widener was 70 years old, living in Monterey Park, working in church administrative offices. Eventually, he agreed to be interviewed. Over several months, he described the operations in detail, and he talked about Gabrielle, his sister who had survived Ravensbrück and lived until 1952 before dying from complications caused by her time in the camp. The interviews revealed something unexpected. Gene Widener still carried every decision as if the war had ended yesterday rather than 40 years ago. He remembered specific refugees, their names, where they crossed, what happened to them. He remembered every network member who died. His wife told researchers that he still woke sometimes from nightmares, calling out warnings to guides who had been dead for decades. In 1989 at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, at 77 years old, Widener gave a speech where he departed from his usual reluctance and spoke honestly. Everyone asks about the courage it took. They want to hear about bravery, about heroism. But that's not what it was. It was being terrified every day for 3 years. It was making choices where every option meant people would die, and you had to choose which people. It was watching friends get arrested, knowing you could warn them, but didn't because warning them would have compromised others. It was learning to live with guilt that never stops, never fades, never becomes bearable. Courage was the people who trusted me even though my plans got some of them killed. Courage was my sister telling me to keep working while she suffered for my choices. I wasn't courageous. I was just someone who couldn't stand by. And once you make that choice, every choice after becomes impossible, but you make them anyway because the alternative is worse. Gene Widener died on May 21st, 1994, in Monterey Park, California, at age 81. His obituary was brief. Former church administrator, survived by wife and children. It didn't mention the Dutch Paris line, or the 812 documented lives saved. It described an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary life, which was exactly how Gene Widener had wanted it. The legacy in 2024, 80 years after the liberation of Paris, the Dutch Paris line remains obscure. Few discuss the textile merchant from Lyon who saved over 800 lives. There are no major films about Gene Widener, no best-selling books. His name appears in academic histories and Holocaust education materials, but ask most people about resistance heroes, and they won't know who he was. This obscurity would have pleased him. Widener never wanted fame. He wanted the refugees he saved to live, wanted the network members who died to be remembered, wanted his sisters suffering to have meant something. But the deeper legacy of Gene Widener's work is more complex than simple heroism. His story challenges comfortable narratives about resistance, about courage. He was not a selfless saint. He was a man who made brutal calculations about who could be saved and who had to be abandoned. He was not a courageous hero facing danger without fear. He was terrified constantly, making choices that haunted him for 50 years. He survived partially through luck and partially through being willing to sacrifice people who trusted him. The uncomfortable truth that Widener's story reveals is that effective resistance during genocides doesn't look like movies suggest. It looks like a textile merchant making nice with German officers while hiding refugees in his storage rooms. It looks like allowing some network members to be arrested so that others can survive. It looks like deliberately deceiving people who trust you. It looks like choosing to save strangers while your own sister suffers because your work depends on you staying operational. It looks like carrying guilt for 50 years. Gene Widener saved over 800 lives not by being brave, but by being strategic. Not by taking heroic stands, but by making compromises. Not by refusing to collaborate, but by exploiting his position as a useful merchant. He survived by being willing to take insane risks when calculations suggested they might work. And he lived with the consequences, the memories, the guilt, the knowledge that his success was built on decisions that would horrify people who wanted resistance to be morally simple. What makes his legacy important is precisely what makes it uncomfortable. Gene Widener showed that saving lives during genocides requires getting your hands dirty. It requires lying to everyone. It requires using people. It requires making choices that feel like betrayals. It requires accepting that you cannot save everyone, that some people will die specifically because of choices you make. And it requires living afterward with the knowledge that you did things most people would judge harshly if they understood what resistance actually demands. The 15,000 plus people alive today because their ancestors were rescued by the Dutch Paris line are Gene Widener's legacy. But so is the uncomfortable truth that their existence required someone to make choices that were strategically correct and morally devastating. So is the reality that effective resistance looks nothing like what we want it to look like. So is the knowledge that the people who saved lives during atrocities are not better than us. They're just people who made the choice to act and then live with consequences that would break most of us. The textile merchant from Lyon who built a smuggling empire under Nazi noses was not a hero in any comfortable sense. He was a man who saw genocide happening and decided his safety mattered less than stopping it, who built a network that saved hundreds while costing dozens, who made brutal choices and carried the weight of them until he died. His courage was not the absence of fear, but functioning through terror. His success was not avoiding moral compromise, but accepting that resistance required compromises that would haunt him forever. That is why Gene Widener deserves to be remembered. Not because his story is inspiring, it's often horrifying. Not because his choices were right, some were devastatingly wrong, but because his example shows what actual resistance requires. Not grand gestures, but sustained work through impossible conditions, strategic thinking that values results over comfort, and the willingness to live with the consequences of choosing action over safety. He showed that ordinary people, textile merchants concerned with fabrics, can change history if they're willing to pay the price that change demands. And the price is never small, and it's never fully paid, and it echoes through decades long after the crisis ends. The bolts of fabric line the walls of his shop in Lyon. Germans browse for uniforms. Vichy officials purchase supplies. And hidden inside those same fabric shipments were documents that meant life or death, routes that led to freedom, and a network that saved over 800 people precisely because a textile merchant understood that the most dangerous cargo could be disguised as the most ordinary commerce. That shop closed in 1945. The building was demolished decades ago. Nothing marks a location where Gene Widener coordinated operations that defied the Gestapo for 3 years. But somewhere in the world today, 15,000 plus people exist because a textile merchant made choices that cost him everything except the satisfaction of knowing those lives continued. That is the legacy. Not fame, not recognition, not comfortable heroism. Just thousands of people living ordinary lives, working, loving, raising children, growing old, because someone decided that his comfortable life mattered less than their survival. If this story hits you, subscribe, like, and share.